Hi, I'm Jenny Edwards, and I'm going to be looking at Good Samaritan laws and their proliferation into communities of young adults who use non-medical prescription opioids, and how knowledge of the Good Samaritan law may actually increase use of the law and therefore prevent overdose deaths related to opioids. Okay, so the problem. We've talked about this in class, but prescription opioid abuse in the US is becoming a problem. It's resulted in increasing rates of drug overdose and increasingly drug overdose deaths. Young opioid users are those who are at the highest risk. They're the most vulnerable population for overdose, yet they usually have the smallest amount of education regarding harm reduction, especially regarding Good Samaritan laws or GSLs. Most often, young adults are scared to contact medical personnel, so this leads to more overdose deaths that could be avoidable if Good Samaritan laws were utilized. So the specific policy that I'm looking at in this study is a Good Samaritan law that is in Rhode Island, but 34 states, including Rhode Island and DC, have some form of a Good Samaritan law or opioid amnesty law. The one in Rhode Island is actually called the Good Samaritan Overdose Prevention Act, and it was enacted in 2012. It gives limited immunity to those who seek medical assistance for someone or themselves due to drug-related overdose. Good Samaritan laws are only effective, though, if those vulnerable populations are aware of such a law, because they can't call medical personnel if they don't know that immunity is available to them. So this study was specifically looking at Rhode Island's Good Samaritan law and was measuring the extent to which it was known in the Rhode Island community in the young adult population aged 18 to 29. It was said that aged population 18 to 29 who use non-medical prescription opioids were the most vulnerable population, so that's what they were looking at. And surveys were used to assess the awareness of this law, as well as how they had acted in instances of overdose, whether they had called 911, whether they had administered naloxone, or any other action. So the methods of this study, as I said before, it was a survey, but there were multiple questions involved in the survey. So some of them were, have you ever heard of Rhode Island's Good Samaritan law? The next one, would you call 911 if you or someone you knew was overdosing, even if drugs were present at the scene? And they asked them if they had experienced or witnessed an overdose if they had actually used the Good Samaritan law present in Rhode Island. And then descriptive statistics were used to compare those who had heard of the law versus those who hadn't. And also descriptive statistics were used to compare the subjects who were willing to call emergency services in a potential overdose event versus those who weren't. So the results. Almost 50% of participants said that they were aware of the Good Samaritan law, but this varied drastically depending on race. Also, participants with a history of drug use were more likely to have heard of Rhode Island's Good Samaritan law. 95% of the study's participants claimed that they were willing to make use of the Good Samaritan law, even if drugs were on the scene. But of those 95%, only 46 were actually aware of the Rhode Island Good Samaritan law. So knowledge of this Good Samaritan law was not associated with a willingness to call, with a p-value of only 0.729. So what does all this mean? As I said before, over 95% of participants were actually willing to call and make use of the Good Samaritan law, which is a huge thing. But those young adults who use non-medical prescription opioids were most likely to learn about those Good Samaritan laws after an overdose incident, but overall education on the Good Samaritan law was uneven depending on race and multiple other factors. So education targeted at non-medical prescription opioid users and their close friends and families may actually lead to a more successful Good Samaritan law and less overdose deaths.